Take it away. All right, welcome everyone. As Martin mentioned, I work in JIRA Frontend platform team, and today I'm going to talk about how we deploy JIRA Frontend. In general, JIRA Frontend is a huge application. As Martin mentioned, 1.7 million lines of code and growing. We have a lot of commits per day, a lot of unique contributors. We deploy at least 6 times to production every day, and we happen to have 13 incidents last month. Those are the averages, so let's dive into what it takes to deploy JIRA Frontend. So first things first, it starts with the process. There are different ways how you could make your deployment safe and making sure that you don't have issues. By default, people think about incident prevention, which is writing a lot of unit tests, contract tests, integration tests, making sure that you have guidelines and diligently make pull request reviews, which is a good strategy to start with. But as application grows and becomes more complicated, it becomes even more complicated to account for all different combinations of inputs in your integration tests. The guidelines could be lagging behind of what you're doing, and it might be hard to keep all the application in mind while doing a pull request review. Eventually, as application becomes more complicated, incident mitigation becomes as important as incident prevention. And that is what we do in JIRA. We are trying to do our best in order not just to prevent incidents, yes, we definitely do that, but also to mitigate when issues happen. And they would happen. There's no way you could discard just a simple human factor. Earlier or later, people will make mistakes. And instead of just breaking all the things, we need to make sure that we are mitigating them properly. An important thing about every incident that we have in production is to learn from it. What we do is, for every major incident, we have meetings called incident postmortems. And there is a link on the Atlassian site which will tell you about that meeting in details. The main idea behind the meeting is to figure out what was the impact of the incident, like how many customers were affected and so on. Identify the timeline, what led to an incident, and what were the actions taken to mitigate the incident. Once we have that established, we are performing a separate exercise called 5 whys in order to understand what was the root cause of the issue. Because yeah, it's easy to say, hey, there was a wrong statement written there, or someone wrote bad code. But usually, quite often times, the actual root cause lies deep below that. For instance, why did person ended up writing bad code there? Well, maybe we were missing some kind of testing or other layers of verification and checking. And once we identify the root cause, we come up with follow-up actions that will ensure that we are not going to have this kind of incidents again. Not that particular incident, because for that particular incident you could come up with a solution like, hey, let's write a unit test for that particular line of code. No, the idea is to come up with a solution that will prevent this whole family of incidents from happening. Also, in JIRA Frontend as well, we are following the idea of you build it, you run it. That means that developers are responsible not just for pumping out features to production, but also making sure that those features are well maintained, and whenever there are issues, they're available to address them. What it means is we are running 24/7 on-call roster for every team. So there's always one person on shift available 24/7 who should be able to respond to monitoring issues within 15 minutes. Within 15 minutes, they're expected to respond, not necessarily fix the issue, because that might take a while, and if you're waking up at 3 o'clock in the morning, it's probably the worst thing that you want to do. You want to mitigate it, as in just make sure that it's not as bad, and we could just come over in the morning and fix it properly. Probably just roll back stuff, figure out how to quickly make it less bad, let's put it this way. On top of that, every team runs TechOps meetings. That is a meeting which we have every week, and the idea behind TechOps meeting is to check the SLOs for the features that we are working on, see if there are any ways we could improve them, improve feature reliability, and also follow up on the previous actions from TechOps, because that is things that people are like, hey, let's do that, and now follow up on that. So that's also a part of TechOps meetings. What happens if we actually have an incident? Essentially, whenever a bug is deployed to production, we call it an incident. For every incident, there is an owner. That is a person who makes decisions during the incident. And for major incidents, which are affecting too many customers, that person is also responsible for external communications, like how we tell our customers what's happening. So what would happen if we have a front-end incident? The easiest one is to turn off a feature flag. Say you have a faulty functionality and there is an easy and fast way to turn it off. Like, yeah, that would be the easiest and fastest solution. Then if that's not available, you probably think about rolling back front-end. So that is a bit of a hammer because it rolls back not just your changes, but also a lot of other changes. But at least the assumption is whatever we roll back to won't be as bad as current incident. Another option is if it's easy to figure out the issue and fix it, well, just fix it and roll forward, deploy master to production. And if nothing happens, nothing helps, sometimes you actually have to escalate and ask for more help because maybe you are unable to fix current incidents, giving people a hand and giving your knowledge. What are the tools that we are using to make it work? So the obvious one is monitoring. And the worst thing that could happen with monitoring is your customers telling you like, hey, by the way, JIRA is down, could you please do that? So ideally, that should never happen, but that still happens. We're trying to make sure that we know if JIRA is down before our customers do. So what we do is we do a lot of monitoring. We monitor different things. Say we monitor technical parameters like time to interactive, time to render, time to first meaningful paint, all those technical things, the time it takes to evaluate our JavaScript bundles. We also monitor different behavioral parameters, like the number of issues people are creating, the number times the number of times they are clicking create issue button, all those small details. On top of that, we are also monitoring unhandled JavaScript errors. So there is a separate service called Sentry. We're using it. Essentially, the idea is whenever there is an unhandled exception, well, we still have a high-level handler that will submit it to a separate service. Once again, whenever we're getting new unhandled exceptions, we're able to notify people. The last thing that we're using is called post-deployment verification. The idea is we have a separate service that runs Cypress code on a real production instance. Well, obviously that's none of our customers' instance. That's a synthetic tenant that we created for ourselves. But nonetheless, it just runs Cypress tests on a real production instance of JIRA and asserts certain conditions. Essentially, the idea is to run heavy paths there, and if heavy path is not working, well, something is completely broken. And we'll probably need to raise an incident and start addressing it. Say, if people are unable to get an issue, well, that's quite a big deal. The other thing that we're using is called feature flags. Feature flags is a pattern of delivering new features in the code. We're using it heavily. Essentially, the idea is whenever you're introducing a new feature, you don't straight commit it into the code. You are wrapping it up in a huge if-then statement, and that if will be the condition of that if will be your feature flag. We're using a third-party service for feature flags, and essentially that allows us to flip those feature flags runtime quite easily. That also means that whenever your feature is causing troubles, you don't need to commit changes to master, wait for deployment, all those things, so wait for a rollback. What you do is you just go to that third-party service, toggle a switch, and you're done. You turned off your functionality. And that is the easiest way to do it, and that is why we are pushing hard for every developer to always use feature flags for their delivery. The other way we're actually using feature flags is to do A/B testing, because you could configure it so that the service will return certain values, say true for 50% of your customers and false for other 50% of the customers. And then you could compare how your feature behaves between those two groups. So let's dive into the actual deployment pipeline and how we mitigate the impact of our incidents by applying some interesting techniques, and maybe some of them might be useful for you as well. So to begin with, it makes sense to explain how JIRA looks like. That's a bit of high-level picture, but essentially whenever a browser makes a call to JIRA, the call goes to one of our web servers. The web server will compose you an HTML page and return it back to browser. Within that page, there will be references to JavaScript bundles which are deployed to our CDNs. So essentially, you're getting HTML page from JIRA, and then your browser makes calls to CDN for JavaScript assets. So, as I mentioned, we are using feature flags, and everything should be fine, but we are still people. Sometimes we make mistakes. Sometimes we forget to feature flag things, or sometimes we are changing the code that was expected to be feature flagged, but it was not. So shit happens. So what we do right now is, instead of deploying to all production at once, we are splitting our deployment and introducing an artificial lag between our deployments. So those rectangles on top, they are, you can think of them as green builds which have artifact to be deployed. So right now we do have 2 staging shards and 6 production shards. Every green build that we have is getting deployed to both staging shards. Then we give it 1 hour of dogfooding. Once it has been dogfooded for at least 1 hour, we deploy it to Asian Pacific region, which is our smallest region. Then we have it in Asian Pacific region for 2 more hours, and only after that we deploy to the rest of production, which is US and EU region. So what it gives us is, it gives us 1 hour of dogfooding in case something's completely broken or there is very important feature like issue creation. I kid you not, our internal developers do create issues in JIRA, and if they are unable to do that, well, that would be a lot of alarms going on, and people will be crazy, and they will be asking like, hey, something's wrong, please do something about that. So dogfooding helps. Sometimes it misses certain issues. So last time the issue we had was related to localization. Probably not all people in our company are using other languages other than English, so they didn't notice it, but we noticed it in AP region, so that was quite fast as well. So once again, just artificially delaying our production deployment training helps us mitigate the impact of our issues. Another thing is alternative deployment. The idea here is that, yeah, I talked about feature flags, but oftentimes it's not as easy to feature flag a feature. Say your feature is you're changing your webpack config, which completely changes the way you're producing your bundles. Or you're bumping an important dependency like React or Angular or something like that. Those are big changes, and they're quite hard to feature flag within front-end code. So what we actually do is we duplicated our build and deployment pipeline to be based on another branch. So by default, we are building and deploying master, but we also created another branch called release alt, and we also build and deploy, do all the sort of progressive rollouts for it as well. And that feature flag, it's not in front-end code. We put that feature flag in the web server. So you remember the one that returns HTML? So based on that feature flag, it returns HTML either pointing to master deployments or to alternative branch deployments. And that is the approach that allows us to release huge and complicated changes. And once again, sometimes shit happens. Sometimes those huge and complicated changes go bad. That wasn't with React 15.16 bump, but that actually happened with one of 16.4, I think, minor bumps. The issue was that we actually experienced significant performance degradation in our old branch. So we rolled it back and started investigating what was happening. And apparently the issue was related to terms and modifications that we were using. So that is the way we are rolling out big changes which are really hard to feature flag. Another interesting thing is called blockers. So what is blocker? Blocker is a JIRA ticket with priority blocker in a specific JIRA project. The way it works is whenever there is any fire, any faulty instance on staging, every developer in Atlassian knows where to create those tickets. Once there is a ticket with that priority blocker in that particular JIRA project, we're blocking any deployment, any promotion to any environment. So the idea is, if you identified something that is happening on staging but not happening in production, you're raising a blocker straight away, and it blocks any deployments. And at that moment, we are asking everyone, like, please, could you help us? We need to investigate and fix that blocker. Blockers are actually harmful. The issue with blockers is the more you are blocking your deployment pipeline, the more changes you're accumulating. So blocker becomes the topmost priority to resolve. Once we figure out how to resolve blocker, probably there will be a change in master branch or just a feature flag. We identify the faulty releases and we mark them as broken. Because the idea here is, as I mentioned, it takes 1 hour of soaking time in staging. If we release the blocker straight away, we could accidentally deploy the faulty releases to production. So we are actually marking those. Yeah, so that is what we want to avoid. So we were marking those file releases as broken. And that means that it's not them that would get deployed, but the last green release before that. And the next one that will get deployed to production would be the one with the extinguisher, which contains the fixed green release. The other thing that we do have is called Frontend Injection. It's not 100% related to deployments. The idea is we are making it simpler for developers to test their features on staging. Essentially, instead of having to run JIRA backend code as well as JIRA frontend code, we created an extension that passes a specific HTTP header into web server. Once web server sees that HTTP header, instead of putting CDN references into your HTML, it will put the contents of that header into HTML. And what you're putting in that header is just location of your local dev server. And that means that that actually allows you to test your local front end on staging. And it also allows you to pass that particular link to other developers so that they could test your branch on staging. The other thing is, on top of that, for every deployment that we have, we store them separately. And that allows you to go back in time and actually check the state of previous deployment. So that helps a lot whenever you are checking which release is not broken. Say current production is broken, you need to figure out which version of production to roll back to. And essentially you're just going back in time, checking different releases until you find like, hey, that is the green one, that is the ones that we are going to roll back to. So that's another helpful feature that we have. I think that's all that I have to talk about. Hopefully that was helpful, and I hope you find some of those tips useful and may start using them in your day-to-day work. Thank you.